My name is Umi Hsu, and my pronouns are they, them.
Thank you. And I guess the first question I want to ask you, it's two questions in one. It's really basically, who are you? Can you tell us about who you are as a person before we talk about your art, and how do you tell your story?
I'm Umi, and I am a Taiwanese American immigrant artist. I work predominantly with sound, music, and generally interested in kind of overall relationship between migration and memory through using sound as a medium of inquiry. I am trans, I am non-binary, and I've also worked for a while in the nonprofit arts world, so also a cultural worker. How do I tell my stories? I think I have this interesting kind of back history as somebody was born in Taiwan and spent the first 12 years in my life in Taiwan, and moved to Virginia with my family, and spent the next 20 years of my life there, and then moved here in California. I was telling somebody earlier, California is sort of a home that I never lived in, but it wasn't until I came here I realized this is home. So I have this kind of fraught relationship to the notion of home because of my diaspora and immigrant upbringing. But I don't know how much of my story you want to hear. Is it more about just how I tell my story, or is it do you want to say anything? Do you want me to say anything?
We have follow-up questions that will
Okay.
go deeper. It's more just to give the viewers a sense of who you are as a person.
Okay.
And not simply focus on your gender identity or the cultural labor that you do, which we will get to.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Okay.
And
That sounds good.
I think you gave a perfect segue to our next question, which is sort of talking about the place that has informed your identity. And you have this interesting story where you were born in Taiwan, moved to Virginia, moved to LA. And I'm wondering if you could tell us how that experience of place has informed who you are, perhaps as a person and as an artist.
Yeah. I recently worked on a sound memoir where I explore the sounds of the place I grew up in. And it was 2 years ago, I decided that I was going to quit my job at one institute to pursue my art practice. And that began a whole journey in sort of revisiting memory, my own memory, but also broadly kind of where memory is held in terms of the place and in terms of the relational dimensions of my life as an individual in the place that I grew up in. So yeah, I grew up in Taipei, and I remember listening to the sound of the street while trying to fall asleep as a kid, and because it was so busy, there was a big intersection, gnarly 6-way intersection near our apartment building, and lots of coming and going traffic, and that sort of provided the white noise background that I would fall asleep to. And then just moving to Virginia in the suburbs where I grew up, starting age 12, 13. I remember the first night just being there, and I couldn't sleep. The sound was it was so quiet. There was hardly any sound besides the crickets. And so I remember hearing my tinnitus, and that becomes a sort of a overarching theme for me for the sound memoir, but also for my art practice, is to kind of search for these like noises, either they're environmental, urban, or in some instances from nature, but also like how they're linked to different aspects of memory making. And some of those noises are actually within my head, in the case of the tinnitus, which is the brain kind of filling in the blank when it's used to be in a sounded environment, but isn't anymore. So
Yeah, that's such a fascinating point in terms of to think about your work as a sound-based artist and how that formative memory was based in sound, right? So I think it's a great way of getting us to the next question, which is I want to ask you to tell us a little bit more about your art. What sort of art do you make, and why are you driven to make it? And what sorts of topics do you explore in your art, and what political relevance does it have for the advocacy you're a part of? I think you've touched on it, but I'd love for you to expand a little bit more.
yeah, sound has always been a conduit through which I connect to people, but also imagine a connection with a world that may or may not exist in reality. The sound memoir was sort of a grounding project in a sense that I felt like I needed to reorient myself to the built environment that I have memories of. But also, I wanted to use it as a way to reconnect with the loved ones around me through storytelling. So, ethnography is a component of my practice in the sense that sound is sort of seen as a relational practice for me. So I always think about sound as something that happens in space because it takes shape differently depending on the echoes, the acoustic qualities of the space, but also the bodies in the room, how sound can travel through the bodies and refract back. And depending on who's there, there's different sort of acoustic qualities. And all those things are the things that I'm interested in. And I think overall, I'm interested in kind of using sound as a medium to travel space. In my projects that are about diasporic experiences, I do that. But also sound as a medium to travel temporal contexts. And so like the memory making, where is memory held, asking these questions about the geography of sound and memory making. And I also I became more interested in kind of memory work within the transgender community. Through my job at one institute, I came into this sort of realization that transgender preservation work just hasn't been an institutional priority for many, many years. So I've asked probably in many ways similar questions as you have. Where is our memory held? And if it's not held by institutions that have the resources to keep them, then how do we make our own and keep our own memories?
Well, you said something really interesting about the spatial and temporal aspects of your work. And I'm wondering, given sort of your diasporic experience and as a gender nonconforming person, I wonder how that dovetails, because I know you also have a PhD in ethnomusicology. So I'm wondering how you see the intersections of both your subject position and your training as both a scholar and an artist, and how that leads you to your work.
A lot of what I do is kind of based on my own questions for myself. I talk to myself a lot. It's from the moment when I started to hear the tinnitus, like I was like, what is going on here? What's the sound that's happening in my ear, in my brain? But also, what does it mean to be in a different environment? And I was lonely. I didn't have anyone to talk to. So I think these conversations, these dialogues with myself has become a sort of a fruitful place for me to like establish this kind of inquiry-based practice that I have. And I think graduate school in ethnomusicology was what I needed. I had been talking to myself, raising these questions, doing these like different research exercises to trying to find out why I feel this way in a sort of a, 1.5 generation immigrant identity, which was a little bit hard to find a community for in Virginia. So I think, I had to like go to school and like find other people to talk to. And graduate training did that for me. In ethnomusicology, I learned, sort of these like disciplinary methods in learning from people, understanding from people, the epistemology of their world views, and how I can use this sort of inquiry practice that I have with myself, but also to be grounded within myself when I meet someone who shares a different knowledge system, a different transmission method. And so all those things all those things are still shaping how I approach the relational aspects of my work. And of course, academia has its own mission in collecting knowledge and ensuring knowledge transmission to go in a certain way to certain people. I, a little while ago, decided to leave academia because I felt like I wanted to speak more broadly to the public, the multiple public spheres that academia at the time wasn't able to afford me. But I think just the artist identity itself is, in a way, a sort of an umbrella term for me. I mean, I think, it allows me to be creative and to produce scholarly-like materials that don't look like books and articles. But I'm still wrestling with very similar questions that I had as a graduate student in ethnomusicology.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that intrigues me about your practice is I always say that artists practice a form of social inquiry that's very similar to academics, but instead of producing, say, an essay, you're producing a body of work that is pursuing certain maybe intellectual or political curiosities you might have. And I'm wondering if that resonates with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Early on in grad school, I quickly learned the limitations of what knowledge production can do as a form of political engagement. And academic freedom comes with a bunch of baggage, and also it calls for privileges that if you don't have, then you're not allowed to actually have that freedom. So, and these privileges could be anywhere between socioeconomic to like just who you are as a person, like race, gender, class, and ability. So, so it was a whole host of things that I felt like I had to negotiate with, and I, worked in the arts and was actually working for the City of Los Angeles Department of Cultural Affairs. So I was like, firmly rooted in kind of a larger bureaucracy that's government run. Then, with the nonprofit work that I did at one institute, I kind of got a taste of, just structurally where and how I would fit in as a cultural worker. And in those jobs, I always felt like I wanted to be able to make a difference. And I was always looking for that point of leverage, just given my position, access to resources, and also where I sit in the larger community, what sort of change was possible. And I was always asking those questions. And then after a while, I felt a little bit worn out, and I felt like I needed some time for myself. And some of that had to do with just being trans and really feeling like, as a human, because when you're an employee, you're also a human. But as a human, was not I was not getting my needs met in these different sort of institutional and organizational settings. So yeah, I mean, so then I think the question of like identity of an artist just, became a nice little container for me to wrestle with the things that I wanted to wrestle with as an individual, as a human.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think, one of the purposes of this oral history project is to think about sort of like socially engaged art as a form of cultural labor that in a lot of ways is under attack. Uh, and I'm wondering if you could tell us, what do you see as the role of artists in articulating political critique, and why does this work matter to you? You did mention that there's like a political dimension to the work that you do.
Yes, I think that any individual has the potential to be thinking and acting politically. And sometimes, given the larger forces in our society, historically or societally, we can be pushed to have to act politically and think politically. Some of it is just by the sheer efforts of trying to continue to live and survive. And I'm finding that more and more so as a member of this trans, gender nonconforming community, that, there are more and more kind of explicit legislative attacks on us. And of course, we've lived through, as a community of people or a population, many of these attacks, some just happening at different levels, micro to all the way to the macro. But I think what we're going through is one of those moments where we're, as a community, being targeted. So that forces us to have to kind of reckon with, what is our role in this, in this time. And I think I see artists participating in this larger discourse, finding ways to respond to the political environment by saying just, who we are and how we survive and make communities, and continue to do that in the way to ensure that we have our dignity, but also stake a claim to our future. And I think, I think cultural workers also have done that. Like, I think folks, who are working curatorial, programmatic, but also just sometimes folks like you, philanthropy, finding ways to kind of really try to learn what's happening and then to tune into the nuance of our needs is really important.
Well, I mean, you just gave us a perfect segue to the next question. 'Cause, part of this project is to work in collaboration with the LA LGBTQ Arts and Culture Coalition, which is trying to find ways to support community members. So I'm wondering if you could speak to, what support do you in particular need as an artist and cultural worker, and how does this intersect with not only your gender identity, but also your work as somebody who performs creative labor?
Our needs, yeah, some of our needs are very, very basic. There are the needs that are being challenged right now. These needs are things like right to access the bathroom facility in private and public facilities, right? And then there's also things like how do we work when a lot of workplaces are hostile to us, and as these kind of federal protections are getting stripped away again. I mean, we had some wins only in 2020, and then like gender identity as a part of Title IX is like, to me, it's like about to change again, So like all those things are changing, and so like how do we continue to like live and work and just be ourselves and have access to medical care, which every human being should be entitled to have. Like, these very basic questions, as anybody would have, I think artists also struggle with, if not in sort of more, in some ways, I think the condition of the artist is indicative of the rights that all human beings should have title to, but if the artist is suffering, then likely everyone else is suffering too in the same way. So I also think that our needs are intersectional. We have, a full life. Some of us have more medical needs than others. Some of us have, like we have relationships to different abilities and disabilities. And we have also immigration struggles, just like everybody else. And for some reason, the conditions through which to protect those other categories of identity often do not include the transgender people's experiences. So I think, those are kind of really, again, basic things that are getting stripped away or we never had in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a common theme that I've heard. I've been working with the coalition, and that's the key thing that comes up is just basic needs: healthcare, access to gender-affirming care. I mean, it's horrible that something as basic as that needs to be advocated for. But I also think there's something about being an artist, right? Where artists have this paradox socially where what we produce is hypervalorized, but the labor we perform is under-resourced and undervalued. So I'm wondering if you could say more about, in terms of like, you're talking to somebody in philanthropy. This is going to be used for collateral for the coalition, I love that you're saying this is an intersectional issue, right? But I wonder if you can speak to sort of like, what does it mean for organizations to fully support artists, in a society that doesn't really value creative labor, but they want the products that we make?
Yeah, I think this is a reflection of how privatized art making puts us in the situation to just be, the things, the people, the objects that are cranking out the products. And in that our labor, our bodies, sort of the basic conditions of how we have to sustain our lives, those things don't matter. And so, yeah, I mean, I think, I think, first of all, we don't have to do things this way. There are different models out there. Privatization of the arts is one way to do it. It is, in fact, I mean, it does seem like the U.S., is pretty good at that relative to the other countries. But there are other means to also support the arts that are more socialized. There are also different kinds of art practices, and I think, things that are more object-oriented that can render transactions and value exchange, those kinds of art practices are better supported than other kinds of art practices. So it's also a question to think through that. Is that a reflection of our value only strictly because we're a capitalist society, or do we have other value systems? I also think that safety, I mean, I didn't talk too much about that, like access to the bathroom, like that's just like a basic thing, but like safety itself is a problem, public safety. safety to be in spaces, sometimes in domestic settings too, like being trans, is sort of unfortunately statistically linked to abuse, assault, and just mortality rates, right? So how do we think about that? Like, does that matter? Like, of course it does. You know, we're not just machines that produce things. And these conversations sometimes come up in policy making. Sometimes, I don't know, do they really come up in philanthropy? I'm not sure. I hope so. But you know, the focus is generally on you know, the output as opposed to, you know, what generates the output, which is the full human beings.
Yeah, I really appreciate your thorough responses, and you know, I don't want to seem Pollyanna because there's so many concrete, real challenges, but you know, part of this project is also, you know, I heard from a scholar that those closest to the issue are closest to the solution, right? And that's part of why we wanted to invite folks to share, you know, what is that solution? And I guess I want, with our next question, really it's thinking about futurity and thinking about liberation, right? Because I think it's very easy to get bogged down in all of the horrible things that are going on. But I think that in order to get to the future we want, we also have to have a vision for what that liberation looks like. And so I'm wondering if you could tell us, what is your vision for a trans future, and what does trans liberation look like for you?
I know I've gone back and forth thinking about this. I always imagine a future where we can coexist, meaning trans people and non-trans people, right? And that we can support each other in our, you know, in our development as human beings. That just seems like it's just lacking. We're so far from that, you know. I don't know. Like, so I think, you know, mainly recently I've been curious about how to get a little bit closer. So like, you know, instead of thinking about the future, I'm thinking about the near future. And I think having done work as a cultural worker in this world and being near kind of archival practices, and I'm thinking about how memory-based practices are important when, you know, a group of people are under attack. The first thing that happens to them is that the cultural meaning of their group, of, you know, their history, is also under attack. And so, you know, collective meaning, collective memory making, all of that is important work. And I think, you know, you're doing this work. There's, you know, thankfully just a whole lot of like kind of, you know, oral history projects that are out there in preserving our memories and our stories today. And I like that these are grassroots organizations doing this. Some of them are tied to like, you know, public libraries and archives and things like that. So maybe some of those things, you know, will have like robust kind of preservation treatment. But even that, you know, I don't know if that's going to be ensuring sort of future proof, right? So I think many is good. Many storytelling and oral history practices, and then getting these, giving people the moment to reflect on their life is a luxury. Like, many of us have to hustle so much in our daily life, and to really think through our time, you know, together on Earth and the multiple lifetimes that we have lived as individuals, and then to make decisions about the different, you know, life points. And I think that as trans people, we have this sort of interesting relationship to life and temporality. We have relived ourselves, and in many moments we have had to make decisions to regenerate ourselves, sometimes to different audiences, sometimes to different groups of people, like families, government, systems. And so it could feel like the world is imposing or imploding because we've had to live multiple lifetimes. But giving us the space to reflect and to also allow people to understand that life is this multiple, there's multiplicity in there. That, our experience isn't strictly trans people's experience. In fact, like, cis people's worldview can be radically shifted and reimagined if they're open to it. And that's what I'm into these days, is to reimagine how we can do this memory keeping work and regenerate new memories for the future, because we need it.
Good. Thank you so much.
Great.
That's it.